radiation detector on my belt screamed its electronic shriek at 0347 hours, the same moment the horizon turned white hot. I dropped my morning coffee, ceramic shattering against the concrete floor of the monitoring station, and dove for the emergency console. The flash lasted 3 seconds, long enough to burn after images into my retinas, long enough to tell me that 20 miles north, something had just vaporized the city of Newport. My name is Torrin Blackwood, and I've been a nuclear systems engineer at the Cascade Point facility for 8 years. I've run countless emergency drills, memorized every protocol, and told myself that the big one would never happen on my watch. I was wrong. The Geiger counter in my hand clicked like an angry insect as I stumbled toward the reinforced windows. Where the city of Newport had sprawled along the coast 20 miles north, I could see a mushroom cloud rising into the pre-dawn sky. The blast had to be massive. I could feel the shockwave rolling toward us across the water, a physical pressure that made my bones ache. "Jesus Christ," I whispered. My throat burned with a bitter, acrid sting like breathing in scorched wires. The radiation was real, measurable, climbing. The detector showed readings I'd only seen in textbooks about Chernobyl. I slammed my palm against the facility-wide alarm. Klaxons wailed through the corridors as red lights bathed everything in hellish illumination. My fingers found the emergency phone, muscle memory dialing the number for the control room. "Kellen, you there?" Static crackled back at me, then his voice, tight with controlled panic. "Torrin, are you seeing this? The seismic readings are off the charts. Whatever hit Newport, it's bigger than anything in our threat assessments." I pressed my face to the window, watching the mushroom cloud spread like a cancer across the sky. "How long do we have before the fallout reaches us?" "That's not our biggest problem." Kellen's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. "I'm tracking massive oceanic displacement. We'd been getting seismic anomalies for weeks near that decommissioned mining platform. Microquakes nobody could explain. I thought it was old drilling residue shifting. Now I'm not so sure." The words hit me like a physical blow. An underwater nuclear detonation meant only one thing: tsunami. Not the 20-foot walls of water we'd planned for, but something biblical. "How big?" I asked, though I already knew I didn't want the answer. "Preliminary readings suggest wave heights of 300 feet. Maybe more. Time to impact, 4 hours, 18 minutes. My legs gave out, and I slumped against the concrete wall. 300 feet. That would put us underwater even here, 40 feet above sea level. The entire coastline would be obliterated. Millions of people between here and the mountains would die. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the folder in my desk drawer, the one marked Overdue Maintenance Priority Alpha. The one I'd been meaning to address for 3 weeks. I pulled it out with shaking hands, flipping through the inspection reports. Cooling System Pump 7 Alpha, the critical component that regulated coolant flow to the reactor core during emergency procedures, had been flagged for immediate replacement. The warning was clear. Failure to replace within 30 days may result in catastrophic coolant system failure during emergency shutdown procedures. Today was day 32. If the tsunami hit while we were running full power, we'd need emergency shutdown procedures. If the cooling system failed during shutdown, we'd lose the ability to control the reactor core temperature. The Cascade Point facility would experience its own meltdown, spreading radiation across whatever remained of the continent after the wave receded. I stared at the report, my name signed at the bottom, acknowledging receipt. I was responsible for this. In trying to balance budget constraints with safety protocols, I'd gambled with millions of lives. The phone rang again. This time it was Veda Morrison, the regional emergency coordinator. "Torrin, I need you to initiate immediate facility shutdown. We're evacuating everyone we can to higher ground, but your plant can't be running when that wave hits." "Veda, we have a problem." My voice came out as a croak. "The cooling system." "What about the cooling system?" I closed my eyes, tasting shame along with the metallic radiation flavor. "Pump 7 Alpha is compromised. If we shut down with the system in this state, we might not be able to prevent core meltdown." Silence stretched between us, filled only with the distant wail of sirens and the steady clicking of the Geiger counter. "How long to repair it?" she asked finally. "Minimum 6 hours for a proper replacement. Maybe 8 if we run into complications." "We don't have 8 hours. We don't have 6 hours." I looked out at the approaching wall of death, then down at the maintenance report in my hands. 2 choices. Shut down now and risk a meltdown that would irradiate whatever survived the tsunami, or keep running at full power and hope the cooling system held when the wave hit us. Neither choice would save everyone, but one might save more than the other. Veda, I need you to listen carefully. There's something else. The plant's emergency bunker system extends 3 levels underground. It's rated for both radiation and flood protection. We might be able to save a few dozen people down there. How many is a few dozen, Torin? I ran the numbers in my head. 48 people maximum, for maybe a week. There are 12,000 people in the immediate evacuation zone. The weight of those numbers settled on my shoulders like a lead blanket. 12,000 lives, and I could save 48. The math was simple and horrible. I need to make a choice, I said. Keep the reactor running and hope we can control it after the wave, or shut it down and risk irradiating whoever survives. What do you recommend? I stared at the maintenance report, at my signature, at the proof of my failure to act. 3 weeks. If I'd replaced that pump 3 weeks ago, we'd have options. Now we had only desperate gambles and impossible choices. I recommend you get as many people as possible to high ground, and I'll do whatever I can to keep this facility from making things worse. Torin, I'm staying, Veda. This is my responsibility. I hung up the phone and walked to the window one last time. The mushroom cloud had spread across half the sky, and I could see the ocean in the distance, strange and restless. In 4 hours, everything I'd known would be underwater. I picked up the maintenance report and fed it into the emergency incinerator. The evidence of my failure turned to ash, but the weight of it remained. 48 people. That's how many I might save if I made the right choices from here on out. I had 4 hours to figure out how to be a hero instead of the man who'd let the world drown. The Geiger counter clicked steadily in my hand, counting down to the end of everything. The emergency klaxon's wail cut through the static-filled air as I stumbled from the observation deck, my ears still ringing from the detonation I'd witnessed 20 minutes ago. The metallic taste coating my tongue had intensified, and I could feel the hair on my arms standing on end from residual electrical discharge. Through the reinforced windows, I watched the horizon glow with an unnatural orange hue where the blast had originated, approximately 40 nautical miles offshore, near the abandoned deep-sea mining platform that had been dark for months. Torin! Kellen's voice crackled through the facility's dying intercom system. Get to control room 3. Now. I ran through corridors lined with flickering emergency lighting, past abandoned workstations where coffee cups still steamed and keyboards blinked with half-finished diagnostic reports. The facility's skeleton crew had evacuated within minutes of the initial blast, following protocol. Only essential personnel remained, myself, Kellen in communications, and a handful of technicians manning the reactor's emergency systems. Control room 3 buzzed with the frantic energy of barely contained panic. Kellen hunched over a bank of seismic monitors, his fingers dancing across keyboards as data streams cascaded down multiple screens. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the air conditioning running at full capacity. The readings are off the charts, he said without looking up. The blast didn't just detonate, it displaced. We're looking at a seafloor rupture extending at least 200 miles in every direction. I peered over his shoulder at the seismic data. The ocean floor had essentially collapsed into itself, creating a massive underwater crater. How much water displacement? Best estimate? 40 billion cubic meters. The waves are already propagating outward at 500 miles per hour. At that speed, we're looking at direct impact on San Francisco, Seattle, even parts of Vancouver. There's no elevation high enough, not in time. His voice cracked slightly. Torin, the first surge will reach our coastline in 3 hours and 14 minutes. Wave height projections they're saying 600 feet minimum. My stomach dropped. Our facility sat on a cliff 30 feet above sea level. Even the highest points inland rarely exceeded 400 feet. That's not possible. The continental shelf would break up waves that size. Not anymore. Kellen switched to a satellite feed showing the ocean's surface. Where there should have been the familiar blue-green of deep water, I saw a dark, churning mass stretching toward the horizon. The blast created a pressure wave that's literally pushing the entire ocean basin eastward. The continental shelf is already underwater. The facility's main communication array crackled to life. Through the static, I heard Veda's voice. All stations, this is Emergency Response Command. We have confirmed tsunami propagation along the entire eastern seaboard. Current ETA to primary population centers, 2 hours, 57 minutes. All available personnel report to designated evacuation zones immediately. I grabbed the radio handset. Veda, this is Torin at Point Reyes Nuclear. We're still operational, but barely. What's the evacuation status? Torin, thank God. We've got chaos out here. Highway 101 is completely gridlocked. Everyone's trying to get inland at once. The coastal rail lines are already flooded from the initial surge. We're setting up emergency shelters in the Berkeley Hills, but capacity is maybe 50,000 people. What about the cities? Static filled the channel for several seconds. When Veda's voice returned, it was tight with controlled desperation. San Francisco is ordering a complete evacuation, but the bridges are bottlenecking. Oakland's already lost its port district to the preliminary waves. We're looking at 7 million people along the coast with maybe 3 hours to get them to safety. The mathematics were impossible. Even if every evacuation route remained open, even if every vehicle moved at peak efficiency, we couldn't move that many people in time. I watched Kellen's screens update with new projections. The waves were maintaining their devastating speed across the deep Pacific trenches. There's something else, Veda continued. We've lost contact with the naval stations at Monterey and San Diego. Satellite imagery shows the preliminary surges already reached them. If those facilities had nuclear materials, she didn't need to finish. Nuclear contamination spreading through tsunami water would make the disaster exponentially worse. Entire regions would become uninhabitable for decades. The facility's outer doors slammed open with enough force to rattle the reinforced windows. I spun toward the sound, expecting to see evacuating staff members, but instead saw a familiar figure striding through the emergency lighting. Yara, my former colleague from the Pacific Nuclear Safety Commission. Her security badge still worked. She'd retained her clearance even after transferring to the Department of Interior 6 months ago. Yara, what are you doing here? I called out as she approached Control Room 3. She looked older than I remembered, with stress lines around her eyes and a manila folder clutched against her chest like armor. I drove straight from Sacramento when I heard the blast. Torin, we need to talk. Privately. Kellen looked up from his monitors. We don't have time for. Make time. Yara's voice carried an authority I'd never heard from her before. Because what I'm about to tell you changes everything about this disaster. I glanced at Kellen, who shrugged and returned to his seismic readings. Fine. But make it quick. The waves are gaining speed with every passing minute. Yara led me to a corner of the control room, away from the monitoring stations. She opened her folder and pulled out a series of photographs, aerial shots of the blast site taken from what looked like a high-altitude reconnaissance aircraft. These were taken by NOAA atmospheric monitoring drones 60 seconds after detonation, she said, spreading the images across a nearby desk. Look at the blast pattern. I studied the photographs. The explosion had created a perfect circular crater in the ocean floor, but the pattern of debris dispersion was wrong. Nuclear detonations, even underwater ones, created distinctive mushroom-shaped plumes. This looked more like a controlled demolition, with debris scattered in precise radiating lines. This wasn't an accident, Yara continued. The blast originated from a deep-sea mining platform that had been abandoned for 3 months. Someone placed charges specifically to create maximum seafloor displacement. That's impossible. Who would? I stopped, understanding flooding through me like ice water. You're saying someone deliberately triggered this tsunami? I'm saying someone wanted to remake the entire Pacific coastline, and they succeeded. She pulled out another document, a geological survey from the Department of Interior. The deep-sea mining surveys from last year identified a critical fault line running along the continental shelf. One properly placed nuclear device could destabilize the entire structure. The implications hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't a natural disaster or even an accidental one. Someone had engineered the destruction of the western United States. Why are you telling me this? I asked. Because according to the facility's emergency protocols, your plant has something that could help. The experimental tsunami barrier system that was installed last year during the seismic upgrades. I stared at her. We installed it during last year's seismic upgrade push, but budget cuts halted live trials. The engineers warned it might destabilize rather than disperse wave energy. A prototype that could create a pressure wave to disrupt incoming tsunami energy. If it works, it could break up the wave structure before it reaches the major population centers. Kellen's voice cut through our conversation. Torin, we have a problem. The preliminary waves are hitting the outer coastal settlements now. New ETA to major population centers, 2 hours, 38 minutes. I looked at the seismic data, then at Yara's evidence, then at the satellite feeds showing millions of people clogging evacuation routes that led nowhere safe. The experimental barrier system had never been tested because the risks were too great. If it failed, it could actually amplify the tsunami's destructive power, turning a 600-foot wave into something even more catastrophic. "We need to get to the underground bunker," I said finally. "The main facility won't survive the initial impact, but the bunker's designed to withstand direct nuclear attack. The barrier controls are hardwired into the emergency systems down there." "What about the evacuations?" Yara asked. Through the radio, Veda's voice crackled with updates. "All stations, we're implementing Protocol 7. Coastal evacuation routes are compromised. We're moving to high-ground shelters and emergency bunkers. Military is establishing temporary refugee camps in the Sierra Nevada foothills." I grabbed the handset. "Veda, this is Torin. We're moving to the bunker facility. There might be a way to disrupt the tsunami using the experimental barrier system, but we need to access the underwater controls." "Torin, whatever you're thinking, be careful. That system was never fully tested. I know the risks. Just get as many people to high ground as possible. We'll handle things from here." I cut the connection and turned to Kellen. "Download everything: seismic data, wave projections, facility schematics. We're going to need every piece of information we can get." As we prepared to descend into the bunker, I caught a glimpse of the horizon through the windows. The ocean had turned completely black, and I could swear I saw the faint outline of an approaching wall of water, still distant but growing larger with each passing second. The preliminary waves had already begun, smaller surges that were merely the precursors to the main tsunami front. The elevator descended into the facility's reinforced underground levels, carrying us toward what might be our last chance to prevent the complete destruction of the Pacific coast. Above us, the first tremors of the approaching tsunami began to shake the building's foundations, rattling the emergency lighting fixtures and sending vibrations through the steel-reinforced walls. Time was running out, and we still had no idea if our desperate plan would save millions of. The bunker's emergency lighting cast harsh shadows across the concrete walls as I stared at the maintenance logs spread across the metal table. My hands trembled, not from radiation exposure, but from what I was reading. 3 weeks ago, I had signed off on coolant system inspections that, according to these records, were never actually performed. The metallic taste in my mouth had intensified, and the static electricity in the air made my hair stand on end. "Torin, you need to see this." Kellen's voice carried an edge I'd never heard before. He stood hunched over the communication console, his face illuminated by the blue glow of multiple screens. "The seismic data from the blast site, it's not matching any known weapon signature." I abandoned the logs and crossed to his station. The concrete floor vibrated beneath my feet with each distant wave impact above us. Through the bunker's reinforced walls, I could hear the muffled roar of water reshaping the coastline. "What do you mean?" I asked, studying the waveform patterns on his screen. "The explosion originated from Sector 7 of the Meridian facility. That's the experimental reactor housing. But look at this." His finger traced a jagged line across the monitor. The energy release pattern shows multiple detonation points, all synchronized within milliseconds of each other. My mouth went dry. Sector 7 housed the prototype fusion containment system we'd been testing. If someone had compromised those containment fields simultaneously, "That's impossible without inside access," I whispered. "Exactly." Yara's voice cut through the air behind us. I spun around to find her standing in the doorway, her dark hair matted with sweat, clutching a waterproof case against her chest. "Because I helped make it possible." The silence that followed was broken only by the distant rumble of another wave striking the surface. Veda emerged from the communications alcove, her radio crackling with evacuation reports. "Yara, what are you talking about?" "I worked on the Meridian project for 2 years before transferring here." Yara's voice was steady, but her hands shook as she set the case on the table. "Dr. Brennan and I developed the simultaneous containment release protocols as a safety measure, a way to prevent cascade failures by releasing all pressure at once." She opened the case, revealing data drives and printed documents. 3 months ago, Brennan contacted me. Said there were irregularities in the inspection reports, that someone was covering up critical maintenance failures. He asked me to help him document everything. I felt the blood drain from my face. "The maintenance logs I've been reviewing are falsified," Yara finished. The real inspections were never performed. The coolant systems in sectors 4 through 7 have been running on emergency protocols for 6 weeks. Kellen's screens flickered as another tremor shook the bunker. If the containment fields were already compromised when someone triggered the release protocols, it would cause exactly what we witnessed, Yara said. A controlled demolition disguised as an accident. The blast pattern was too precise, too perfectly timed to destabilize the ocean floor. Veda's radio crackled with urgent reports. Coastal Command to Bunker 7. We're reading massive underwater displacement. The second wave is 3 times larger than projected. ETA 47 minutes. I stared at the documents Yara had spread across the table. Inspection reports signed with my authorization, maintenance schedules I'd never seen, approval codes that matched my clearance level. Someone's been using my credentials. Dr. Brennan suspected as much, Yara said. That's why he arranged for me to be transferred here 3 days ago. He knew something was planned for this facility. Where is Brennan now? Veda asked. Yara's expression darkened. He died in a car accident 2 days ago. Brake failure on a mountain road. The pieces clicked together in my mind with sickening clarity. This wasn't terrorism. It was a cover-up. Someone knew about the maintenance failures and decided to eliminate the evidence permanently. Kellen's fingers flew across his keyboard. If that's true, then the experimental tsunami barrier system in our lower levels. The experimental tsunami barrier system in Sector 12's lower levels. It's still operational, Yara said, pulling up new documents from her case. But there's something critical you need to understand about why it exists. Kellen looked up from his screens. What do you mean? The barrier wasn't designed for natural disasters, Yara continued. It was specifically engineered to counter the exact type of synchronized containment failure we just witnessed. Dr. Brennan suspected someone might try to weaponize the fusion reactor release protocols. The barrier system is a network of underwater sonic disruptors positioned along the continental shelf, Yara explained, bringing up detailed schematics. It can theoretically break up wave formations before they reach critical mass, but the power requirements are enormous. Possibly, Yara said grimly, but the system was never fully tested. The computer models showed it could work, but at this scale. She pulled up schematics on one of Kellen's screens. The power requirements alone would drain our entire grid. We'd have to shut down life support, emergency communications, everything. I studied the barrier system diagrams, noting the complexity of the sonic disruptor network. The system is powered by our 3 backup reactors, correct? How long would we need to maintain full power? At least 6 hours for the initial wave disruption, Yara replied, checking her calculations. But with the continents already flooding, we'd need to keep it running for days to prevent the water from settling into permanent sea level changes. Veda's radio crackled with panicked voices. All coastal stations, this is Maritime Command. We're showing complete infrastructure failure along the eastern seaboard. Requesting immediate evacuation of all inland facilities within 200 miles of current coastline. 200 miles? Kellen's voice was barely audible. That's everything. The entire eastern third of the continent. The implications hit me like a physical blow. If the evacuation zone had expanded to 200 miles, that meant the first wave had penetrated far deeper inland than any of our models had predicted. I looked around the bunker at the faces staring back at me. 3 people who knew the truth about what had happened. 3 people who might be able to stop it from getting worse. If we activate the barrier system, I said slowly, we'd be cutting power to the evacuation centers. The people Veda's been coordinating with, they'd lose their life support systems. How many people are we talking about? Veda asked quietly. Yara checked her calculations on Kellen's screen. The evacuation centers within our power grid are currently sheltering approximately 15,000 people. And if we don't activate the barrier, the next wave will be strong enough to push water inland for 300 miles, Yara said, her voice flat. Current population in that zone is roughly 40 million. The weight of the choice settled over us like a physical force. Save 15,000 people we could see and communicate with, or gamble on saving 40 million we couldn't reach. There's something else, Yara added, her voice barely above a whisper. The barrier system has never been tested at full power. If the sonic disruptors overload, they could create a resonance cascade in the ocean floor. How much worse could it get? I asked, though I dreaded the answer. Potentially global. The vibrations could trigger fault lines along every major coastline worldwide. Kellen's screens flickered again, and this time they didn't stabilize. We're losing primary power faster than expected. The water infiltration is affecting the electrical systems. How long do we have before we lose the ability to activate the barrier? Veda asked. Maybe 40 minutes, Kellen replied, checking his diagnostics. After that, the control systems will be completely flooded. I stared at the activation key in my hand, a simple metal card that would either save millions or potentially doom the entire planet. The bunker shuddered again, more violently this time, and I could hear water beginning to seep through the outer seals. We need to decide now, Veda said. I have evacuation coordinators waiting for my signal. If we're going to cut their power, I need to warn them immediately. The documents on the table told the story of corruption and cover-up that had led to this moment. Someone had chosen to hide their failures behind mass murder, and now we were left to clean up the consequences. Yara, I said, meeting her eyes directly, in your professional opinion, what are the actual odds the barrier system will work without causing the resonance cascade? She was quiet for a long moment, running calculations in her head. 60%, maybe 70% if everything goes perfectly. And if we do nothing? 0% chance of survival for anyone in the flood zone. I looked at each of my companions, Kellen with his technical expertise and unwavering focus, Veda with her impossible responsibility for thousands of lives, Yara with her guilt over the knowledge she'd helped create the tools for this disaster. The people in the evacuation centers, I said to Veda. How long can they survive without power? Emergency batteries will last 4 hours. After that, she didn't need to finish. I knew what happened when life support systems failed in sealed underground shelters. I closed my eyes and felt the weight of 40 million lives pressing down on me. The metallic taste in my mouth had become overwhelming, and I could feel the static electricity making my skin tingle. When I opened my eyes, I knew what we had to do. We activate the barrier, I said. But first, we give the evacuation centers everything we can. Transfer all non-essential power to extend their battery life. Give them 6 hours instead of 4. That might not be enough time for the barrier to complete its cycle, Yara warned. Then we'll have to make it work faster, I replied. Kellen, can you modify the power distribution to give us maximum barrier efficiency in minimum time? I can try, he said, already turning to his controls. But we'll be pushing every system past its design limits. Better than the alternative, Veda said grimly. She keyed her radio. All evacuation centers, this is Bunker 7. We're implementing emergency power conservation protocols. Switch to battery backup in 30 minutes and prepare for extended communications blackout. As the others began their preparations, I stared at the activation key in my hand. In a few minutes, I would either save the world or help destroy it. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same systems I'd failed to properly maintain were now our only hope for survival. The bunker shuddered again, more violently this time. Through the sealed walls, I could hear the ocean claiming more of the surface world. Water was now visibly seeping through the outer seals, forming small puddles on the concrete floor. We were running out of time, and the hardest choices still lay ahead. The first wave hit at 14:32 hours, exactly as Kellen had calculated. I watched through the reinforced observation window as a wall of dark water, taller than any building I'd ever seen, crashed over the coastal highway. The sound reached us even through 30 feet of concrete and steel, a roar that seemed to come from the earth itself. Seismic stations are going dark, Kellen reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. Portland, Seattle gone. No response from any coastal monitoring station north of San Francisco. His fingers moved across multiple screens, each one showing red alerts. Wave height at impact was 230 feet. It's not stopping. I gripped the metal railing, my knuckles white. The radiation detector on my belt clicked steadily, a metallic rhythm that had become the soundtrack to our nightmare. 3 hours since the blast, and we were still breathing poison with every gulp of recycled air. Veda, what's the evacuation status? I called across the bunker's command center. She looked up from her communications array, her face grim. I've got 17,000 people staged at the inland checkpoints. That's everyone who made it past the first evacuation deadline. Another 43,000 still moving through the mountain passes, but they're running 12 hours behind schedule. Her fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up real-time tracking data from the emergency transponders. The second wave projections have them in the direct impact zone. Show me. The wall display flickered to life, showing a topographical map of the western United States. Red zones marked the areas already underwater, a jagged line of destruction stretching from British Columbia to Northern California. Yellow zones showed the predicted path of the second wave, due to hit in approximately 4 hours and 20 minutes. The yellow covered everything within 200 miles of the coast, including the mountain passes where 43,000 people were trapped. The mountain passes will be flooded, Yara said quietly. She'd been staring at the same data for the past hour, her face pale. Everyone's still in transit. They won't make it to the safe zones. I felt something cold settle in my stomach. 43,000 people. Families with children, elderly couples, teenagers who'd never gotten the chance to live. All of them following evacuation routes that would become death traps. What about the barrier system? I asked. Can we activate it before the second wave? Kellen shook his head. The control systems are in Sector 7. That's 3 levels down and completely flooded now. The radiation readings there are over 400 Roentgens per hour, and rising as the water carries contaminated debris through the lower levels. He gestured at the flickering lights above us. With the backup power failing, we'd need to manually override every safety protocol while underwater. How long would someone have in that radiation field? In a full radiation suit? Maybe 15 minutes before the seals fail from water pressure. 10 minutes before acute radiation syndrome kicks in. He didn't finish the sentence, but I knew what came next. Death within hours, not days. The bunker's emergency lighting flickered again, casting dancing shadows on the concrete walls. Through the observation window, I could see debris floating in the floodwater. Cars, pieces of buildings, things I didn't want to identify. The water level was still rising. "Ma'am," one of Veda's technicians called out, "I'm getting emergency broadcasts from the inland stations. The people in the mountain passes, they're asking for confirmation on the route changes." Veda's hand hovered over her microphone. I saw the conflict in her eyes, the weight of impossible choices. "Tell them to maintain current heading," she said finally. "We need them clear of the coastal zones." "But the second wave. I know what the second wave will do." Her voice was sharp, final. "We stick to the plan." I stared at her. "You're sending them into a flood zone." "I'm buying time for the people who can still be saved." She turned to face me, and I saw something broken in her expression. "The inland zones have concrete shelters, higher ground. If we tell the mountain pass evacuees to turn back now, they'll clog the emergency routes. The people who might actually survive will be trapped with the ones who can't be saved." The logic was sound. It was also monstrous. "There has to be another way," I said. "Show me." Veda's voice was hollow. "Show me how to save 60,000 people with resources for 17,000. The radiation detector on my belt clicked faster. I glanced at the readout. We were at 75 Roentgens per hour, even here in the bunker, and climbing. The containment protocols I'd helped design were failing as floodwater carried radioactive debris through the facility's lower levels. "The barrier system," I said. "If we can get it online before the second wave hits." "It's experimental," Yara interrupted. "We don't know if it'll work. Hell, we don't know if it'll make things worse." "Worse how?" She pulled up another display, this one showing oceanographic models. "The barrier creates a standing wave effect. If the timing is wrong, it could focus the tsunami energy instead of dispersing it. Turn a 300-foot wave into a 500-foot wave. And if the timing is right, then it might reduce the inland penetration by 40%. Maybe save the people in the outer evacuation zones." She paused, studying the projections. "But there's only a 12-minute window where activation would help instead of making everything worse. 30%. It wasn't much, but it was something. "What do you need to activate it?" I asked. Kellen consulted his tablet. "Manual override in Sector 7, then a synchronized startup sequence from the main control room. The whole process takes about 22 minutes, including the time needed to get through the flooded sections. And the radiation exposure? Lethal. The water down there is carrying dissolved reactor fuel. Even with a full suit, you'd be dead within 6 hours." I looked around the bunker at the 3 people who'd become my world. Veda, still coordinating evacuations for people she knew she couldn't save. Kellen, running calculations on systems that might or might not work. Yara, carrying the weight of knowledge she'd tried to suppress. "There's something else," Yara said quietly. "The blast wasn't random. I've been analyzing the seismic data, cross-referencing it with the maintenance logs I falsified." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Someone used my fabricated inspection reports to calculate the exact structural weaknesses." "What do you mean?" Someone knew exactly where to place the device to maximize the oceanic displacement. The blast point, the timing, the depth, it's all too precise to be accidental. The cold in my stomach spread to my chest. You're saying this was deliberate? I'm saying whoever did this had access to classified structural reports, knew about the barrier system, knew about the evacuation protocols. They didn't just plan for our responses, they planned around my lies. Her hands shook as she pulled up more data. The blast point, the timing, the depth, it's all calculated to exploit the exact vulnerabilities I helped hide. The lights flickered again, and this time they stayed dim. Emergency power was failing faster than predicted. Ma'am, the technician called to Veda. Inland stations are reporting seismic activity. The second wave is accelerating due to underwater landslides triggered by the first impact. Veda's hands clenched into fists. Time to impact. 3 hours, 47 minutes. I felt the weight of 43,000 lives pressing down on me. People following evacuation routes that would become underwater graveyards. People who trusted that we knew what we were doing, that we had a plan. The barrier system, I said. We have to try. It's suicide, Kellen said flatly. So is doing nothing. Veda looked up from her console. Even if you activate the barrier, I'd still have to shut down the evacuation routes to divert power to the system. The people already in the mountain passes will die anyway when the second wave hits. But the people in the inland zones might survive. I closed my eyes, trying to shut out the clicking of the radiation detector. When I opened them, Veda was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Not anger, not fear, but something deeper. Recognition, maybe. The acknowledgement that we were all walking into the dark. If we're going to do this, she said, we need to do it now. The longer we wait, the less chance any of this works. I nodded. Yara, I need you to pull up the barrier activation protocols. Kellen, can you map the safest route to Sector 7? Safest is relative, he said, but he was already pulling up the facility schematics. Veda, how long before you have to shut down the evacuation routes? 22 minutes. The power grid is failing faster than predicted. She gestured at the dimming lights. After that, we won't have enough juice to run both the evacuation communications and the barrier system. 22 minutes to reach Sector 7, activate the barrier controls, and get back to the command center for the synchronized startup. In radiation levels that would kill us all, through flooded corridors filled with debris. The bunker shuddered as another piece of debris struck the observation window. Through the reinforced glass, I could see the water level rising steadily. Soon, even this underground facility would be flooded. There's no guarantee this will work, I said. No, Veda agreed. But it's the only chance those people have. I picked up my radiation suit from the equipment locker. The material felt thin, inadequate against the invisible death that waited in the flooded corridors below. The suit's radiation badge was already showing yellow. We were all accumulating dose just by being here. Kellen, you're with me. Yara, stay here and monitor the systems. Veda, I know what I have to do. The intercom crackled to life, filled with static and desperate voices. Emergency broadcasts from the evacuation routes, people asking for guidance, for hope, for someone to tell them they were going to live through this. Veda reached for the microphone, then stopped. Her hand trembled slightly before she pulled it back. They deserve to know, she said quietly. They deserve to live. The radiation detector clicked faster, keeping time with my heartbeat. Outside, the second wave was building, a wall of water that would reshape the continent. Inside, we were preparing to walk into a radioactive tomb. But for the first time since the blast, I felt something other than despair. Not hope, exactly, but purpose. A reason to keep moving forward, even if the path led nowhere but death. Let's go, I said. The bunker's heavy door cycled open with a pneumatic hiss, revealing the flooded corridor beyond. The water was chest deep, dark and filled with debris, twisted metal, chunks of concrete, and things I didn't want to identify. The current was stronger than expected, pushing contaminated water through the facility's broken circulation systems. My radiation detector began screaming, a continuous tone that meant we were now in a lethal radiation field. The display showed over 800 Roentgens per hour. We stepped into the flood, and I knew we weren't coming back. The bunker's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as I watched the radiation detector in my hand climb past every safety threshold we'd ever established. 3 hours had passed since the second wave receded, but the Geiger counter's frantic clicking told me what the ocean had left behind. a radioactive wasteland stretching inland for miles. Torin, the barrier system is responding to manual input. Kellen's voice crackled through the intercom from the control room 2 levels up. But I'm reading massive power fluctuations. The seawater infiltration damaged more systems than we initially assessed. I pressed the radio button with trembling fingers. How much power do we need for a full barrier activation? Minimum 68% facility output. We're running on backup generators at 32%, and that's with all non-essential systems offline. Veda's voice cut through the static from the evacuation center. The refugee bunker is drawing 14% of our power. 943 people, including 212 children from the coastal settlements. I felt the familiar weight of numbers, the terrible mathematics of survival. The evacuation center's power draw meant the difference between barrier activation and continued catastrophe. I'd seen the seismic readings Kellen had shown me an hour ago. A third wave was building in the Pacific. Satellite imagery suggested it could be 50% larger than the previous 2. There's another option, Yara said quietly. She'd been silent since confessing her role in covering up the safety violations that had made this disaster possible. The reactor core is still partially active. If someone manually overrides the safety protocols from inside the containment chamber, we could get the power we need. The implications hit me like a physical blow. Manual override meant someone had to enter the reactor chamber itself, bypassing every automated safety system we'd installed. The radiation levels would be lethal within minutes, even in a full environmental suit. That's suicide, Kellen said flatly. The core's been compromised since the blast. The containment field is holding, but barely. Anyone who goes in there dies within 15 minutes, I finished. But the override would work? Yara nodded, her engineer's mind already working through the technical details despite the horror of what we were discussing. The manual controls are hardwired to the primary power distribution grid. EMP-proof, flood-proof. If someone can reach the central console and input the override sequence, we'd have full power within 6 minutes. Veda's radio crackled to life. I'm looking at the facility schematics. The path to reactor containment goes through the flooded maintenance tunnels in Sector 4. Whoever goes down there will have to navigate in contaminated water, in the dark, with failing life support. The route is approximately 800 meters through knee-deep radioactive seawater. I closed my eyes, seeing the facility's layout in my mind. The reactor chamber was accessible through passages that were likely flooded with radioactive seawater. Even in a full radiation suit, the journey would be a death sentence, but so would doing nothing. I'll do it, I said. No. Kellen's voice was immediate, decisive. I've been monitoring the radiation levels since the blast. My exposure is already beyond acceptable limits. Look at my dosimeter readings. He held up his personal radiation detector. The numbers made my stomach clench. He'd absorbed nearly 400 Roentgens since the initial blast, enough to guarantee severe radiation sickness within days. I won't last the week anyway, he continued, his voice steady despite the death sentence he was pronouncing on himself. The nausea started 2 hours ago. My hands are already showing tremors. The silence that followed was deafening. I'd seen the subtle signs, the way he'd been steadying himself against walls, the pallor of his skin, the way he'd quietly stopped eating. Besides, he continued, you know the facility better than anyone. If something goes wrong with the barrier activation, you're the only one who can improvise a solution from the control room. I wanted to argue, to find another way, but the numbers were undeniable. Kellen was right. His radiation exposure from the initial blast had already sealed his fate. And if the barrier failed, if the third wave hit while we were still trying to coordinate a response, satellite projections suggested casualty numbers in the tens of millions. There's something else, Veda said, her voice heavy with the weight of command decisions. The evacuation center is reporting system failures. The bunker's getting more contaminated seawater through the breach in Sector 7. I can reroute power from life support to give us the extra juice we need, but the people in the evacuation center won't survive without life support, I finished. How long would they last? Yara asked. Maybe 18 minutes. 22 if they stay calm and don't panic. The air recycling system would fail first, then the heating elements. Another impossible choice. 943 lives weighed against the barrier system that could stop the next wave, the one that satellite data suggested would be even more massive than the first 2. Do it, I said. Reroute the power. Veda's silence lasted too long. Torin, there are children in that center. families who trusted us to keep them safe. And there are millions more who will die if we don't stop this now. The words tasted like ash in my mouth. We knew this was coming. We knew the choices we'd have to make. I'll make the announcement, Veda said finally. Tell them what we're doing. Why we're doing it. They deserve to know. I watched Kellen checking his radiation suit one final time, his movements deliberate and calm despite the tremor in his hands. He'd accepted his fate with the same methodical precision he brought to every technical problem. The override sequence is Alpha 77 Delta 9 Kilo, Yara recited, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. Input it at the central console, then activate the manual power routing. The system will need exactly 6 minutes to reach full output. 6 minutes, Kellen repeated, sealing his helmet. Got it. I handed him my backup dosimeter. Take this. Monitor your exposure. If you start hitting critical levels before you reach the console. I'll keep going anyway, he said simply. This is bigger than any of us now. The intercom crackled with Veda's voice, addressing the evacuation center. Attention all personnel. This is Emergency Coordinator Veda. Due to critical system requirements, we need to temporarily redirect power from life support. This is necessary to prevent additional tsunami waves. Please remain calm and conserve oxygen. Power will be restored within 30 minutes. I couldn't hear the response, but I could imagine it. The fear, the anger, the desperate pleas. 943 people watching their life support systems shut down, knowing they'd been sacrificed for the greater good. Torin, Kellen said, checking his oxygen supply one final time. If this works, if the barrier holds, promise me something. What? Make sure people know what Yara did. She made mistakes, but she's trying to fix them. Don't let her carry this guilt alone. I nodded, unable to speak. Kellen activated his suit's emergency beacon and headed toward the flooded access tunnel. The water was waist-deep, black with debris and radiation. He paused at the threshold, looking back at us one final time. See you on the other side, he said, then disappeared into the contaminated darkness. The facility's power grid flickered as Veda executed the reroute. Somewhere above us, 943 people were beginning to suffocate so that millions of others might live. The moral weight of it pressed down on me like the ocean itself. I watched the radiation monitors, tracking Kellen's progress through the facility's sensor network. His suit's beacon moved slowly through the flooded passages, each step taking him deeper into a radioactive hell that would kill him long before the oxygen ran out. Torin, Yara said quietly, there's something else I need to tell you. About the safety violations. About why this happened. I turned to face her, seeing the guilt and fear in her eyes. What is it? The blast wasn't random. Someone wanted this to happen. The safety protocols we bypassed, the maintenance records I falsified, we were following orders. Orders from people who knew exactly what the consequences would be. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. This wasn't just negligence or cost-cutting. This was deliberate. Someone had engineered this disaster, knowing it would kill millions, reshape continents, change the world forever. Who gave the orders? I asked. I don't know. They came through encrypted channels, authorized by classification codes I'd never seen before. But whoever it was, they wanted the coastal regions flooded. They wanted the world's geography to change. The implications were staggering. If Yara was right, if this was planned, then everything we were doing, the sacrifice, the desperate choices, the terrible mathematics of survival, was part of someone else's design. But it didn't matter. Not now. Millions of people were still at risk, still counting on us to stop the next wave. Whatever conspiracy had caused this disaster, our duty remained the same: save as many lives as possible. Kellen's at the reactor chamber, I announced, watching his beacon on the monitoring system. Initiating manual override in 10 seconds. The facility's power grid roared to life, every system suddenly operating at maximum capacity. The barrier system's status indicators flickered from red to amber to green. We'd done it. Enough power to activate the experimental tsunami barrier. But in the evacuation center, 943 people were dying so that millions could live. And somewhere in the world, the people responsible for this disaster were watching their plan unfold exactly as they'd intended. I keyed the radio to Kellen's frequency, but heard only static. His beacon had gone dark somewhere in the reactor chamber. He'd given his life to save strangers he'd never meet, in a world that would never be the same. The barrier was ready. The choice was made. Now we'd learn if our sacrifices had been worth it. The reactor core's emergency lighting cast everything in hellish red as I descended the maintenance ladder, my radiation detector screaming warnings I'd long since stopped hearing. Above me, the facility shuddered under another massive wave impact. The experimental tsunami barrier system hummed with unstable energy, its magnetic field generators pushed far beyond safe parameters. Torin, radiation levels are spiking, Kellen's voice crackled through the comm system, weaker now after his exposure in the control room. The containment field won't hold much longer. I could taste copper in my mouth, feel the familiar burn of radiation poisoning starting in my chest. The metal rungs were slick with condensation and my own sweat. 300 feet below the surface, the primary cooling system pumps had failed completely. Without manual restart, the barrier would overload and collapse, sending the remaining tsunami energy straight into the continental shelf. I could taste copper in my mouth, feel the familiar burn of radiation poisoning starting in my chest. The metal rungs were slick with condensation and my own sweat. 300 feet below the surface, the primary cooling system pumps had failed completely. Without manual restart, the barrier would overload and collapse, sending the remaining tsunami energy straight into the continental shelf. Veda, status on the evacuation? I called out, knowing the answer would be bad. I had to seal the outer bunkers, her voice came back hollow, defeated. The water broke through sectors 7 and 8. We lost 300 people, Torin. They were right there, and I had to choose between them and keeping power to the barrier. The weight of those deaths settled on my shoulders as I reached the core level. Through the reinforced glass, I could see the fuel rods glowing with unstable energy. The coolant levels were dropping faster than projected. Kellen had done his job perfectly. The barrier was active and holding back the worst of the tsunami's secondary waves. But the power draw was killing our containment systems. I'm at the manual override, I reported, pulling on the thick rubber gloves. The control panel was already showing dangerous temperature readings. Yara, what's the status on the pressure release valves? Static answered me for several seconds. When her voice finally came through, it was tight with pain. I'm having trouble reaching the secondary controls. The radiation in this section is worse than we calculated. But Torin, I found something else in the maintenance logs. What is it? The blast wasn't random sabotage. Someone wanted this specific outcome. The targeting of our facility, the timing with the tidal cycles, even the fail-safe overrides, it's all too precise. Someone knew exactly how to trigger a continental tsunami. My hands froze over the coolant pump controls. Who? I don't know. But whoever it was, they're not done. There are other facilities marked in the system. This was just the first phase. The implications hit me like a physical blow. We weren't just dealing with a disaster. We were dealing with a coordinated attack on global infrastructure. The tsunami wasn't the end goal, it was the beginning. Kellen, can you access the network from your position? We need to warn the other facilities. I'm trying, but... His voice faded, then came back weaker. The satellites are down, landlines are flooded. Even if I could get through, would they believe us? Would they shut down their systems based on our word? Another wave impact shook the facility. The barrier was holding, but I could hear the metal superstructure groaning under the stress. The experimental magnetic field was creating its own problems. Electrical systems throughout the bunker were failing, and the air itself felt charged with static energy. I started the manual coolant pump sequence, feeling the machinery respond sluggishly. The radiation levels in the core were climbing beyond the safety charts. Even with the hazmat suit, I could feel the energy cooking my cells. This was a one-way mission, and we all knew it. Veda, how many did we save? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. 1,400 in the primary bunkers. Maybe 50 more in the auxiliary shelters, if the seals hold. Out of... She paused, and I could hear her crying. Out of nearly 4,000 in the evacuation zone. The numbers were staggering. We'd failed to save 3/4 of the people we'd sworn to protect. But those 1,400 lives were still lives. And if we could keep the barrier stable, prevent the complete collapse of the continental shelf, maybe other coastal regions would have time to evacuate. The pump's responding, I reported, watching the coolant levels slowly rise. But I'm seeing pressure build up in the primary circuit. The system wasn't designed for this kind of sustained load. Can you release it manually? Kellen asked. Yeah, but it'll vent radioactive steam directly into the ocean. The contamination will spread for hundreds of miles. Do it, Veda's voice was firm. We're already looking at decades of radiation cleanup. A few hundred more miles won't matter if it keeps the barrier stable. I reached for the pressure release, then stopped. Through the core chamber's observation window, I could see something that made my blood run cold. The fuel rods weren't just glowing, they were cracking. Hairline fractures were spreading through the uranium cores, and the magnetic field from the barrier was making them worse. "We have a bigger problem," I said. "The barrier's magnetic field is destabilizing the fuel rods. If they fail completely, we'll have a full meltdown. The barrier will collapse, and the radiation will contaminate everything from here to the Arctic." "How long do we have?" Yara asked. I checked the readings, ran the calculations in my head. Maybe 30 minutes before complete failure. Less if another big wave hits. "Then we shut it down," Veda said immediately. "We can't risk a complete meltdown. If we shut down the barrier, the remaining tsunami energy will hit the continental shelf full force," Kellen protested. "The geological models show complete submersion from here to the Great Lakes. We're talking about 50 million people. The choice was impossible. Save the people in the immediate path of the tsunami, or prevent a nuclear catastrophe that would poison the entire region for generations. Both options meant massive casualties, but one was certain death, the other was a slow poisoning that might claim even more lives over time. "There's a third option," I said, my hands moving over the controls. "I can manually regulate the fuel rods, keep them stable while the barrier operates. But I'd have to stay here, in the core chamber. The radiation exposure would be lethal within hours." "Torin, no," Veda said. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way. The automated systems are failing, and the manual controls are in the hot zone. Someone has to monitor the fuel rods continuously, or we lose everything." I could hear Kellen's labored breathing through the comm. "I'm already exposed from the control room." "You're needed on the barrier controls." I cut him off. "This is my facility, my responsibility. I should have caught the maintenance falsifications earlier. This is on me." The facility shuddered again, and I watched the fuel rod stress indicators climb higher. We were out of time for debate. "I'm staying," I announced, beginning the manual stabilization sequence. "Yara, get to the surface and try to establish contact with other facilities. Warn them about the coordinated attack. Kellen, maintain the barrier for as long as possible. Veda, get those people as far inland as you can." "Torin," Veda started. "No arguments. We knew this was a one-way mission when we started. At least this way, we save who we can." I disabled the safety locks on the core chamber and stepped inside. The radiation levels were immediately lethal, but the manual controls responded to my touch. The fuel rods stabilized, their dangerous glow settling into a more manageable pattern. The barrier held steady, its magnetic field containing the worst of the tsunami's remaining energy. Through the intercom, I could hear my team coordinating the final evacuation procedures. Yara's voice was getting fainter as she climbed toward the surface. Kellen maintained his position at the barrier controls, his breathing becoming more labored. Veda organized the survivors, preparing them for a world that had changed forever. "Barriers holding at 60% efficiency," Kellen reported. "The wave energy is dissipating, but slowly. We need another 4 hours for complete stability." "Fuel rods are stable," I confirmed, watching the temperature readings. "I can maintain them for maybe 6 hours before system failure." What I didn't say was that I could feel the radiation cooking me from the inside. My hands were already starting to shake, and the metallic taste in my mouth was getting stronger. But the controls were responding, and the barrier was doing its job. "Torin," Veda's voice was soft. "The survivors want to know, what do we tell them about the world outside?" I looked at the monitoring screens, showing the devastating scope of the disaster. Entire coastlines were underwater. Major cities were submerged. The geography of the world had been permanently altered. But the barrier was holding, and the worst-case scenarios were being prevented. "Tell them we stopped it from getting worse," I said. "Tell them that the people who caused this didn't win completely. And tell them that somewhere out there, other facilities are still operating, other people are still fighting." The hours passed in a blur of radiation sickness and desperate concentration. I kept the fuel rods stable, while Kellen maintained the barrier. Yara managed to reach the surface and establish brief contact with 3 other facilities, warning them about the coordinated attack. 2 of them immediately went into emergency shutdown, preventing similar disasters. By the time the tsunami energy finally dissipated, the cost was clear. The barrier had worked, but at enormous cost. The immediate coastal areas were saved from complete destruction, but the nuclear contamination would make vast regions uninhabitable for decades. The coordinated attack had succeeded in reshaping the world's geography, but not in destroying civilization completely. "System stable," I reported, my voice barely a whisper. "Fuel rods are contained, barriers powering down safely. The immediate crisis is over." "Torin, we're coming to get you," Veda said. "No." I could barely hold the control handles anymore. "Radiation levels are too high. The core chamber is sealed for a reason. But the facility is safe now. Take the survivors and head inland. The contamination will spread, but slowly. You have time to get clear." I watched the monitors as my team made their final preparations. Kellen managed to reach the surface before the radiation exposure became fatal. Yara had established contact with emergency services inland. Veda led the 1,400 survivors toward higher ground, away from the contaminated coastline. The world they were walking into was different from the one they'd known. Continents were reshaped, coastlines were permanently altered, and the nuclear contamination would affect generations. But humanity had survived, and the coordinated attack had been partially thwarted. As my vision began to fade, I kept my hands on the controls, maintaining the systems until the very end. The fuel rods remained stable, the contamination contained to the immediate area. It wasn't the victory we'd hoped for, but it was the victory we'd earned. The last thing I heard was Veda's voice over the intercom, reporting that the survivors had reached safe ground. 1,400 lives saved, countless more protected from complete continental collapse. The price had been enormous, but the alternative had been unthinkable. In the end, we'd done what we could with the choices we had. The world would rebuild, scarred but surviving. And somewhere in the flooded ruins of the facility, the barrier held steady, a monument to the price of preventing the worst possible outcome.